The presence in northern Africa of both Italian and British colonies and protectorates guaranteed that there would be fighting there from the moment that Italy threw in its lot with the Axis. The contest swung back and forth for over 2 years, but by early 1942 the Afrika Korps were driving up to the Egyptian border. The dazzling prospect of seizing the Nile Delta and linking up with German forces in the Ukraine was once more in sight for Axis strategists. The ability of the Afrika Korps to do this, and indeed the ability of the British to stop them, depended ultimately on the timely arrival to the desert armies of adequate supplies of troops, equipment, and above all, fuel. At first glance it seemed that the Axis powers had the advantage in this race. The geographical position of Italy in the central Mediterranean made British convoy runs from Gibraltar to Alexandria extremely risky. The alternative route, around the Cape of Good Hope and up through the Red Sea and Suez Canal, was safe but very long. In contrast, Axis convoys had only a short journey from southern Italy to the main ports in Tunisia. In their way, however, stood Malta. At the beginning of the war, both sides had underestimated the importance of this tiny island. Lying as it did within half an hour's flying time of the Italian airfields in Sicily, most strategists had written it off as indefensible. Indeed, it took some time for the British to be sufficiently aware of its importance to make substantial reinforcements to the garrison. Once strike forces of aircraft and submarines began to operate out of Malta in appreciable numbers, however, Italian merchant losses en route to Tunisia began to climb alarmingly. At strategy conferences, the Italian Naval Command, Supermarina, increasingly began to call for the threat posed by the island to be eliminated. Everyone agreed this would be a desirable course of action, but somehow and some way there always seemed to be more pressing demands for the men and equipment needed. The operation was postponed again and again. Certainly storming Malta would not be easy. The defences were strong, and the British would be bound to make the utmost effort to sustain the island if it were attacked. Another factor was that the initial attacks would have to be made by paratroops, and the Germans were wary of such operations following the horrific casualties they had suffered in Crete. Rather than invade Malta, the softer decision was taken to neutralise it by concentrated aerial bombardment. Of course, the island had been under continuous air attack from the moment Italy had joined the war, but now heavy reinforcements were deployed to intensify the bombardment. In February of 1942, Hitler authorised the redeployment of Flieger Corps II from Russia to the Mediterranean theatre expressly for the purpose. To further tighten the siege, the Germans also commenced a mining campaign of the sea approaches. The British countered by flying in strong reinforcements of Spitfires via carrier sorties, but fighters need fuel and ammunition. The only supplies arriving were small specialist cargoes brought in by submarine. By the middle of May, even though by now the bombing attacks had slackened off, the island was in dire straits. If Malta was to continue as an offensive base, it was essential that supplies be convoyed in, whatever the risks. Knowing the need was easier than achieving the end. It was a time of great trial for the Royal Navy. Nearly 3 years of war had steadily whittled down the number of operational vessels. The end of 1941 had seen the loss of the aircraft carrier Ark Royal and the battleship Barham to U-boats, and the crippling of the battleships Valiant and Queen Elizabeth in Alexandria Harbour by Italian frogmen. The entry of Japan into the war had forced the creation of an Eastern Fleet to defend India. Fear for the Cape routes prompted the War Cabinet in London to undertake the emergency countermeasure of invading Madagascar, and their naval forces allocated to this operation were still unavailable. There simply were not enough ships, especially heavy ships, to ward off the threat posed by the Italian Navy. The situation was so serious that the British decided to run 2 convoys in the hope of splitting the opposition. The reasoning was that if the Axis mustered to check one convoy, the other one might still be able to get through. From Alexandria, what remained of the Mediterranean fleet would escort 11 merchant ships, codenamed Operation Vigorous, while Force H, reinforced by units from the Home Fleet, would escort 6 merchant ships from Gibraltar, Operation Harpoon. The 2 were timed to arrive on consecutive days to avoid overloading the harbour facilities at Valletta in Malta, as well as to divide the inevitable air attacks that would be made. The plan for Operation Harpoon was identical in concept to that of similar successful convoy runs undertaken from Gibraltar in 1941. The units available were divided into 3 forces. Force W, under the direct command of Vice Admiral Curtis, made up the main covering force and contained the heavy ships. These would check any sorted by the Italian fleet and blunt the initial air attacks expected from Sardinia. The capital ships were themselves highly vulnerable, however, so they were scheduled to turn back upon reaching the dangerous shallows of the Skirky Channel between Cap Bon and Sicily. Protection for the final run into Malta would be given by the light units of Force X. The approach through the Narrows was timed to be made at night to further lessen the air threat, and long-range fighter protection from Malta itself would be available the following morning. A strong mine-sweeping force was included to be retained at Malta as a permanent solution to the island's mine clearance problem. Force Y was a refuelling flotilla which would completely oil the smaller ships for the outward voyage, and then remain in the western Mediterranean to refuel Force X on the return passage. This also ensured that as few ships as possible would have to call into Gibraltar, which was rife with Axis spies. Finally, a screen of 4 submarines was created to patrol off the main Italian naval bases. The escorts available were hardly ideal. The only battleship, Malaya, was old and had not been refitted for some time. Of more concern were the 2 aircraft carriers. Both were old, slow and poorly armed. Neither had armour protection and they carried very few aircraft. Together they could put up no more than 10 fighters at once, patently inadequate to beat off the massed air attacks expected. The aircraft themselves did not have the greatest performance, and they were further hampered in their protective duties by the fact that neither of the carriers had radar or modern fighter direction apparatus, making it difficult for them to coordinate air patrols. The biggest weakness, however, was strategic. Force X, entrusted for the final run into Malta, was simply too light for the task. It was widely appreciated that the Axis had the capability to confront any convoy with superior surface units, but it was assumed that the main opposition would come from aircraft on the erroneous belief that the Italian Navy had not acted decisively to block convoys in the past. Force X was well equipped with anti-aircraft guns, but less well prepared for surface action. Only the 5 big fleet destroyers fielded 4.7-inch caliber armament. The rest of the escorts carried old 4-inch guns, and the small Hunt-class destroyers were not fitted with torpedoes. Moreover, in spite of precautions, it did not take the Axis long to realise that a major operation was in the offing. Rumours of steamships about to leave Alexandria for Malta had been revealed by POWs as early as June the 2nd. More suspiciously, in order to try and blunt the Axis response, the RAF raided Italian bases, particularly Taranto, several times just before the convoy entered the Mediterranean. Italian agents reported that Force H was at sea with a convoy on June the 11th. At first, the Italian High Command thought this might be a diversion, but when the air reconnaissance confirmed that the convoy was heading towards Malta, all stations were put on alert. As far as ships were concerned, this did not amount to much. The Italians were indeed planning to rely on aircraft to deal with threats from the west. The bulk of the Italian surface fleet was committed against the vigorous operation to the east. Only the 7th Cruiser Division, based at Cagliari, could be spared to face the Harpoon convoy. The Italians had planned to patrol the Skirky Channel area with 3 squadrons of motor torpedo boats, but in the event unusually heavy seas prevented their deployment. The Germans were not able to contribute very much. Fliegerkorps 2 had been withdrawn, and so therefore the Luftwaffe in Sicily was confined to a single group of Junkers 88 bombers and a single group of Messerschmitt 109 fighters. The Italians, on the other hand, had nearly 350 combat aircraft in the western Mediterranean area, but serviceability was appallingly low, less than 50%, and there was an acute shortage of ammunition, particularly torpedoes. The main strike bomber used was the tried and trusted SM-79, which had been blooded in the Spanish Civil War. As a torpedo delivery system, it was quite dangerous, but it was horribly vulnerable itself when making attack runs. The Italians also fielded a few examples of an SM-79 development, the SM-84. Finally, Sicily boasted a single squadron of Italian-manned Junkers 87 Stukas, recently trained by the Luftwaffe in the technique of dive bombing. The principal reconnaissance aircraft was the Kant Z501 seaplane, a reasonable design but hampered by short range. They were also tactically misused as high-level bombers, an attack method already proven to be almost completely ineffective against mobile maritime targets. The main fighters used was the Machi 200 Thaeta and the Regi 2000, with a few CR-42 biplanes still in service in Sardinia. The Harpoon convoy sailed from the Clyde on the 5th of June. The escorts refuelled at Gibraltar in relays, and the convoy was at full strength by 0800 on the 12th of June, by which time it had passed through the Straits and was sailing into the Mediterranean at a speed of about 12 knots. The weather was perfect, the sea glassy calm, and the sky very clear and sunny, all bad for the defenders. Clear skies made it easy for Axis reconnaissance aircraft to spot the convoy, but conversely, the sunlight produced glare and made it difficult to spot approaching aircraft at long range. The calm waters made for very poor ASDIC conditions. Throughout June the 13th, Axis planes regularly made contact with the convoy and shadowed it, in spite of the efforts of fighters from Argus and Eagle. The weaknesses of the 2 carriers were already becoming apparent. The best way for carriers to launch aircraft is to turn into the wind, but what little there was on this fine, calm Mediterranean spring day was blowing west to northwest from astern, which meant that to quickly launch fighters the carriers would effectively be detaching themselves from the convoy. Being old and slow, it took them a long time to catch up. During this time they were vulnerable and would need escorts themselves, which weakened the guard around the transports. In order to try and minimise these disadvantages, Curtis adopted an unusual formation. The merchant ships were deployed in the traditional two lines, the port one headed by the cruiser Kenya, the starboard one by the cruiser Liverpool. 3 motor launches were assigned at the rear of each column, where they could double as rescue ships. The battleship Malaya, escorted by Welshmen, brought up the rear. Each of the carriers was assigned an anti-aircraft cruiser and a destroyer and ordered to manoeuvre separately to port. The remaining destroyers and minesweepers were deployed in a conventional screen around the convoy, but at the unusually great distance of 3 to 3.5 miles from the main body. In this way they would better be able to protect the carriers if they detached. They would also be able to engage aircraft for longer and with both broadsides. The Italians, meanwhile, had their own problems. The low endurance of their reconnaissance planes made it difficult for them to maintain continuous contact. It was for this reason that an airstrike launched at 1930 from Sardinia failed to locate the convoy. Moreover, the Italian planes claimed to see Welshmen sailing ahead of the convoy. She was not actually due to detach until the Skirky Channel. Acting on this erroneous information, the 7th Cruiser Division sailed from Cagliari and attempted an interception north of Tunisia. On the way they ran to the specially deployed British submarine patrol line. P211 spotted the Italians but could not get into position to attack, could only radio in the contact. P43 was able to make an attack, but she missed. On receipt of the submarine contact reports, strikes were also prepared using Malta-based bombers. British reconnaissance planes duly detected the Italian cruisers in the early hours of June the 14th, but without flares, it being night, they were unable to attack. The Italian commander, Admiral Dazzara, soon realised that the mysterious contact that had provoked his move was false, so he aborted the strike and sailed his force onto Palermo. Dawn of June the 14th found the Harpoon convoy 120 miles southwest of Sardinia, well within effective range of the air bases there. Shadowing aircraft soon appeared. The first radar warning of an incoming raid was made at about 1000, just as fighters from Eagle had destroyed an Italian scout plane. The first attack came in about 30 minutes later. It was made by Italian CR-42 biplanes acting as fighter bombers. They attacked in 2 groups of 4, one coming in from astern and the other from out of the sun, and concentrated on the aircraft carrier Argus. Bombs burst all around the carrier, but she managed to escape being hit. The next attack reached the convoy at around 11:30 and was in 2 well-coordinated waves. While 10 Cants carried out a level bombing attack, a wave of about a dozen SM-79s and SM-84s, strongly escorted by fighters, broke through the portside screen at about 500 feet. They then rounded the convoy's stern, split into groups and attacked the starboard side. The British made several emergency turns to keep their sterns to the attackers, but 2 torpedoes found their mark. The cruiser Liverpool was hit in the engine room as she turned to meet the attack. The second torpedo hit the merchant ship Tannenbar amidships and sank her very quickly. A second wave of a dozen SM-79s attempted the same tactic, but a heavy barrage forced them to drop their torpedoes at long range. All were avoided, and several Italian planes were destroyed. Liverpool was in no danger of sinking, but reduced to 1 shaft and a speed of 3 to 4 knots, she had to be taken in tow by the destroyer Antelope. Escorted by another destroyer, the Westcott, they made for Gibraltar. The little group was attacked repeatedly, but managed to avoid receiving further damage and arrived at the Rock on June the 17th. Welshmen took the cruiser's place at the head of the starboard column. The afternoon was uneventful, but the convoy was now coming into range of the Sicily air bases. At 1820, an attack by 12 Junkers 88s caught the defenders by surprise. Coming in high from astern, they had almost dived to a bombing position before they were spotted by the ship's gunners. British fighters managed to make several of them jettison their bombs, but a fairy funnel was lost. No ships were hit, although many of them, especially the carriers, had some very narrow escapes. One bomb landed on the port beam of Argus and dived right under her before exploding on her starboard side. Just before 2000, another coordinated attack on the same pattern developed. About 20 Italian SM-79s came in low from the northeast, circled round the stern of the convoy out of gun range, and then attacked the starboard side. Simultaneously, 10 German Junkers 88s came in high ahead and dropped bombs along the entire length of the convoy, while 15 Stukas attacked the port side. The convoy countered by more emergency turns to keep their sterns to the torpedo attacks, but they were hampered by already being in some disarray. The escorts had been prosecuting a suspected submarine contact and were not in ideal positions. A wild melee ensued, with aircraft chasing around the ships and the skies full of tracer, although nevertheless no damage was done, although Argos did have to dodge 3 torpedoes. At 2100, 4 Beaufighters from Malta made an appearance. It was a heartening sight for the defenders because the Skirky Channel had been reached, and as planned, Force W was detached back to Gibraltar. As they turned, the Italian submarine Alaghi attacked the Eagle but missed, then escaped undetected. The convoy redeployed into a single long line, and under the command of Acting Captain Hardy of Cairo, steered southeast to keep as close as possible to the Tunisian coast. At 21:30 in the dusk, they were subjected to a last unsuccessful air attack. At almost the same time, the Italian 7th Cruiser Squadron was sailing from Palermo, with orders now to intercept the convoy south of Pantelleria. The Italian cruisers were duly spotted by British aircraft, but their course was not determined. Shadowing proved to be impossible owing to a shortage of reconnaissance aircraft and the preoccupation with watching Taranto. Suspecting that Dezzara's force might be sailing to reinforce the main Italian fleet, air patrols were instead concentrated over the Straits of Messina. The night passed quietly for the convoy, but Curtis had plenty to think about. By the time reports of the sailing of the 7th Cruiser Division reached him, the 2 British forces were nearly 50 miles apart. If these vessels were steering to attack the convoy, Hardy's covering force would be heavily outgunned. One of the Force W cruisers could be detached to assist, and with hard steaming it would just be able to support Hardy by morning. The difficulty was that Force W would still be within range of the Sardinian air bases for most of the following day, and one less cruiser would seriously weaken its anti-aircraft cover. Considering the narrow escapes of the carriers early in the day, and the value of even these obsolete vessels, Curtis eventually decided not to split his force. It was a decision that would be questioned later. At dawn, the convoy was 30 miles south of Pantelleria, steering southeast at 12 knots, with Malta less than 12 hours away. The merged ships were back in 2-column formation, with Cairo leading. The 12th Destroyer Division was deployed to port, the 11th to starboard. The minor escorts were clustered at the convoy's rear. Air cover from Malta had arrived in the shape of another 4 long-range Beaufighters. Spitfires would be available from about midday. Everything seemed to be going well, but at 0620, one of the Beaufighters reported 2 enemy cruisers and 4 destroyers, actually 5 destroyers, just 15 miles to the north. Hoping to gain time for a Malta airstrike, Hardy turned the convoy south and began to lay a smoke screen with the smaller destroyers. Dezzara's force soon hove into view dead ahead. 2 of their destroyers had been forced to return to Palermo, but the Italians still had a big advantage in number and calibre of guns. They opened fire at 0640 at a range of over 10 miles, well outside that of the British 4-inch and 4.7-inch guns. Their gunnery was extremely accurate, Cairo being almost immediately straddled. Several shells also fell amongst the merchant ships before they could be completely obscured by smoke. The 5 big British fleet destroyers, led by Commander Scurfield in Bedouin, raced out to attack the Italians. Cairo and the smaller Hunt-class destroyers, armed only with 4-inch guns, remained with the convoy and continued to lay smoke to cover it. Dezzara responded by steering southwards across the convoy's route to Malta, while continuing to fire on Cairo and the advancing British destroyers. The Italians had every reason to be cautious. Both their reconnaissance planes and ships claimed to have spotted a Southampton-class cruiser with the convoy. As the Italians advanced, their destroyers started to lag behind. Taking advantage of this, Dezzara ordered the 2 slower ones, Vivaldi and Malacello, to circle round and break through the transports, while he pinned the escorts with fire from his cruisers. The brunt of the Italian cruiser fire fell on Bedouin and Partridge, both of which were disabled within 15 minutes. The 4.7-inch guns of Matras and Marne hit back at Vivaldi, which came to a stop on fire and with a boiler out of action. The Italian ship was in some danger, but Malacello stayed to give her assistance, and events elsewhere prevented the British from pressing home their advantage. Having completed the smoke screen, Cairo and the 12th Division had moved to support Scurfield's fleet destroyers, engaging the Italians at extreme range. The patrol of Beaufighters had withdrawn for lack of fuel, and their reliefs had not yet arrived. Consequently, the convoy was only protected by the meagre barrage of the minor escorts, when at 0700 8 Italian Junkers 87 Stukas dived down on them. The merchant ship Chant was promptly hit by a complete 3-bomb stick. She blew up and sank in minutes. The tanker Kentucky was disabled by a near miss. She was taken in tow by the minesweeper Hebe. About this time, Cairo was hit by a 6-inch shell, although little damage was done. Realising that the Italians were reluctant to penetrate the smokescreen and that air attacks had restarted, at 07:15 Hardy ordered the remaining 3 active fleet destroyers to pull back and reform on Cairo. Over the next 30 minutes this group and the Italian cruisers exchanged a heavy fire. Both sides' shooting was accurate, but no more hits were scored. Vivaldi took advantage by managing to repair one of her engines and limped off to Pantelleria, still escorted by Malicello. At 0800 Desaro detached his remaining 3 destroyers to assist. Commodore Pilditch of the convoy, believing the escorts were now holding their own, had ordered the convoy to resume course for Malta, and it was now heading slowly southeast. Hardy saw that Desaro's cruisers had now worked across the convoy's path. Hardy therefore ordered the convoy to reverse course again and laid another smoke screen. The 2 sides continued to exchange fire whenever a target loomed out of the smoke. Happily for the British, the Italian cruisers had now run out of high explosive shell. This explains why another 6-inch shell penetrated to Cairo's engine room but did not explode. The convoy was now in some peril, still some way from Malta with the powerful Italian cruisers closing in. But at 0840 Desaro stood off to the north-east. Apparently he had come to the conclusion that the convoy was on a heading that would carry it north of a minefield. Wary of the smoke screens, he therefore headed for the gap between this minefield and Pantelleria, reasoning that the British would have to come through there in order to get to Malta. By 0930 the 2 sides were out of sight. Hardy meanwhile was pulling the convoy and the escorts back together again. This took over an hour, and even then progress to Malta was much slowed by the need to tow the disabled Kentucky. Partridge had repaired herself sufficiently to take the Bedouin in tow. Spitfires from Malta arrived to cover the final approach, and at 10:30 they drove off some German bombers. However, their low endurance meant they could not stay for long, and in between them leaving and their relief arriving, another combined attack by Stukas and SM-79s disabled the freighter Birdwin around about 11:20. Hardy decided to cut his losses. Air attacks showed no sign of abating, and the Italian cruisers were still in the area. Malta was still 150 miles away, and the cripples were restricting his force to only 6 knots. He resolved to abandon them and concentrate on getting the 2 undamaged freighters into Malta. Hebe was ordered to detach her tow and sink the Kentucky, and the destroyer Badsworth detailed to sink the Birdwin. Partridge, which was by now out of sight to the rear of the convoy, was given orders to abandon Bedouin, which had proven unable to repair the damage to engines. However, this instruction was disobeyed. The 2 turned and made for Gibraltar. Meanwhile, Desaro had been waiting in vain for the British ships to appear. 3 of his destroyers are now out of action. Vivaldi's engines had broken down again. She had been taken in tow by Premuda, and escorted by Malicello, the 3 had made for Pantelleria. At 10:30 he was unsuccessfully attacked by Beauforts and Albacores from Malta. Soon after this he finally decided to steer southwest to hunt for the convoy. At 13:40 alarming news reached Hardy from Hebe. The task of sinking Kentucky had proven to be too much for the tiny minesweeper, and she had abandoned the tanker, set off alone after the convoy. At 12:55, while still 25 miles to the rear of it, she had been spotted and damaged by the returning Italian cruiser force. Hardy at once gathered the remaining 3 active fleet destroyers and led them off to the rescue. At 13:55 the Italian force came into sight, but just as Hardy prepared to engage them, they turned westwards and opened fire at some target over the horizon from him. He realised the victim must be either Bedouin or Partridge. Pragmatically, he decided that nothing could be done to help them. The safety of the convoy had to come first. He gathered up Hebe and headed back to it. The Italians were cruising around, sinking the various cripples that had been abandoned. Kentucky was sunk by a torpedo, and Birdwin fell to the guns of the Italian destroyers. Then Desaro's ships found Bedouin and Partridge. Partridge slipped her tow, laid smoke to cover Bedouin, and tried to draw the Italian fire. The odds were too great, however, and the intervention of Italian bombers only brought the end quicker. One of them put a torpedo into Bedouin at 14:25. She sank very quickly, but a great many of the crew were picked up and made prisoners by the Italians before Desaro received orders to withdraw to the Trapani area. Partridge managed to slip away and reach Gibraltar, in spite of being further damaged in an air attack. Cairo and the rest of the escort rejoined the convoy about 15:30, and it was further augmented 2 hours later by a Welshman, which had successfully unloaded her cargo at Malta and sailed to rejoin. The convoy was attacked twice more from the air, once at 19:10 and again at 20:40, by about a dozen bombers each time. By this time the convoy was under considerable protection by Malta Spitfires, and neither attack ever looked like having any chance of success. However, there was to be one last trial. Originally it had not been intended to dock Cairo or the destroyers at Valletta harbour, but the heavy fighting had exhausted their anti-aircraft ammunition and they had to enter to replenish. Due to a combination of their own disordered state and a signalling error, the convoy moved into an unswept area of sea ahead of the minesweepers. The destroyers Badsworth, Kujawayak and Matchless, the minesweeper Hebe and the transport Arari duly exploded mines, and in spite of all efforts, Kujawayak eventually sank. Fortunately, the others only received minor damage and were able to make the Grand Harbour at Valletta. The two transports between them delivered some 20,000 tons of badly needed supplies to scenes of wild excitement from the local population. Cairo and the 4 remaining undamaged destroyers, together with the indefatigable Welshman, sailed again on the 16th to rejoin Admiral Curtis. They were attacked mercilessly from the air from 1200 until dusk at 2030. None of the ships were damaged further and managed to rejoin Curtis the following day. The tanker Brown Ranger, which had stood exposed for several days on its own, also managed to disengage successfully. Matchless and Badsworth were confined in Valletta's battered dockyard for repairs. The results of Operation Harpoon were not entirely satisfactory for either side. Tactically, the Axis had undoubtedly had the better of it. The British had lost 3 freighters, 2 destroyers and a tanker. 1 cruiser, 3 more destroyers and a minesweeper had been seriously damaged, and several other ships had received minor damage. The only heavily damaged Italian ship had been the destroyer Vivaldi, although all the others involved had taken a few minor hits. In the air, the British Fleet Air Arm had lost 8 aircraft, one being an Albacore torpedo bomber from Malta. Axis air losses are notoriously difficult to estimate, but were probably around about 25 to 30 planes. The key to the Axis success was the coordinated use of air and surface assets, a combination they used all too infrequently in the Malta convoy battles. Desara put in a workmanlike performance, but a little more aggression might have brought the entire convoy to disaster. As it was, by delaying it and drawing off the escorts, he had created conditions for the deadly Stukas and Junkers 88s to deal heavy blows. Strategically, Harpoon was a minor success for the British. Their idea of running 2 convoys simultaneously from each end of the Mediterranean was sound enough, but in the event the Axis had proven to have enough resources to deal with both. The sister convoy, Operation Vigorous, had been a disaster. It had suffered heavy casualties in both merchants and escorts, and confronted by the Italian surface fleet, had been forced back to Alexandria. The arrival of only 2 freighters and 20,000 tons of supplies hardly broke the Malta siege, but it did give the British enough time to mount another, larger convoy operation. The experiences of Harpoon paved the way for the Pedestal convoy in June of 1942, leading to possibly the greatest convoy battle of them all. The Harpoon Vigorous experience had shown that a convoy from Alexandria was just not feasible under the existing conditions. It also pointed up the need for more modern carriers with better fighter direction. Pedestal was allocated no less than 4, and another was provided for an extended training session in fighter direction before the operation commenced. Harpoon also showed that a heavy anti-aircraft barrage was essential, not because it destroyed many enemy planes, but because it forced them to release their weapons at long range. In Harpoon, the 6-inch battery of Malaya in particular seems to have caused many SM-79s to drop their torpedoes far too early. The lessons were learnt well. The sheer volume of fire put up by the Pedestal escort so disconcerted Axis airmen that hardly any damage was done by the air attack in initial stages. The through escort for Pedestal was much more substantial and effectively deterred Italian surface attack, apart from torpedo boats. Pedestal casualties were very heavy, but 5 merchants managed to get through, breaking the siege. Without the experiences of Operation Harpoon, that might very well not have happened.